Continue the program. Okay. Evaluations, as I said, are being handed out now. So, and again, please return them, for both sessions at the end of the time. I'm sure everybody unfortunately woke up this morning to hear the terrible news that we heard. And I've been asked to announce, someone just got it on an iPhone, that there's a worldwide Tehillim taking place at 3 p.m. So that'll be right as this program is finishing. And we're asked to say the parakim of 120, 121, and 130. So if everybody could take that, if they want to stay a few extra minutes, I'm sure there's Tehillim in the back. But we can't discount ever the importance of davening, and certainly davening as a united front. And that's certainly something that our peace partners don't understand. So again, it's parakim 120, 121, and 130. We certainly can. Absolutely, I think that would be very. I assume there's probably Tehillim. I'm going to look and see, if I can find how many Tehillims I can find. It is my pleasure to call upon Rabbi Aryeh Bursik from STAJE, who will tell us a little bit about STAJE and will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Rabbi Steinig. Thank you again for all the work that you put in for all 4 weeks of this wonderful lecture series. We're very grateful at STAJE for all that she's done. And of course, we're thankful to each and every one of you for coming. I'm sure other people have other things that they could have been doing. It's not easy to get here to all the different locations, and we're very grateful for everyone to coming. I've spoken to many of you over the last couple of weeks, some in person, some by phone, about who we are and what we're trying to do. Our goal is, again, to try to offer opportunities for really what we've been discussing over the last 4 weeks, particularly to pick up on Dr. Dorn's theme. The opportunities for engagement, for activity, for attentiveness was her word. Whether that's through learning or through volunteer opportunities, we're looking to try to find ways to work with you to find things that you're interested in and that we can arrange, we can orchestrate, we can facilitate, we can launch, and ways to really help the entire community, both locally and throughout the area. So if people have ideas, we have some survey forms in the back on the Margaret Teats table, and my cards are out. I'd love to hear people's feedback and thoughts. And I don't want to take up any more of anybody's time, so I'm just going to call up Rabbi Dr. Weiss, who is really very uniquely qualified to speak. The theme is, I believe, Torah perspectives on medical issues, and as a rabbi practicing in a quite large local kehillah, I've been davening there quite recently, and it's really a very special place. The camaraderie, both to me as somewhat of an outsider and watching between the congregants after davening, before davening, is really very special. So as a Rav of a local shul, as a doctor, someone who has a great perspective on medical issues, on Torah issues, and I'd like to call up Rabbi Dr. Weiss.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Bursik. I want to thank Rabbi Steinig for spearheading and including our shul, which hosted, I think, last week's session, and 2 weeks ago. Okay, I'm a little out of time. It could be. I'll have to bear that in mind. And all the participating sponsors, Margaret Teats, of course, and the various organizations, the OU. I want to make sure I don't miss anyone. I'm sure they've been mentioned. But the OU, OHEL, and STAJE. Well, that was just mentioned as well. This also is part of the, I think. So I wanted to take the opportunity this afternoon to speak for a little bit about health issues from a Torah perspective, specifically focusing on preventive medicine, health maintenance, and talk about that from the perspective of Judaism, of Jewish halacha. Acknowledge many of the members from Hillcrest, Young Israel Hillcrest, and welcome to all of you, and hope that this day was meaningful, and hope that you have a healthy winter. In terms of print, don't forget the flu vaccine as well. But that is related to this issue, but I'm not going to talk about vaccines specifically at the moment. But I wanted to begin with the following description as recorded by the Chavetz Chaim. The Chavetz Chaim from Radin, who died in like 1933, is well known for his work on Shmiras Halashon, on the protection and dignity of speech. Every year, the Chofetz Chaim Heritage Foundation sponsors videos on Tisha B'Av regarding this particular issue. So the Chofetz Chaim wrote voluminously his classic work on Halacha, Mishnah Berurah, but he has in his Sfarim Likutei Amorim the following kind of digression from his main theme that he was discussing there. But it's very interesting to look at it from a historical perspective, because we're all familiar with the Surgeon General's warnings that came out in the 1960s regarding cigarette smoking. So the Chofetz Chaim, speaking in, I don't know when he wrote this, presumably around 1920s or so, wrote the following: Agav, Dasi Lidan, I want to kind of digress and talk about Odos Ishun HaSigarin, the smoking of cigarettes. Nedaber Ktsat Odot Zeh, Hine Kama Rofim, even at that time, 1920s. So Kama Rofim Gozru, Omru Shekol Mishu Chalush, that somebody who perhaps has a predisposition to illness, is perhaps their constitution is not so healthy, so that cigarette smoking is a potential issue. So he talks about this particular issue of cigarette smoking early on. Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva that talks about cigarette smoking and the approach to that, and whether the issue of the fact that a person has the right to engage in certain recreational activities. To what extent does a person have a right to engage in recreational activities? To what right does a person have a right to engage in parnasa, in kind of their own professional that can potentially be hazardous? Moshe also has a tshuva, think about like football players, like in terms of the risks that they take. So it talks about this issue. So just interesting historically that he already discussed this issue back in the early part of the 20th century, even before it was more brought up to date in terms of smoking and various issues associated with it. So the question that, just to use that as a starting point, to what extent do I have an obligation to myself? Let's just focus on myself as an individual. Let's say I'm not talking about to what extent that may affect someone else. Maybe we'll come to that in terms of a person who has a contagious disease, to what extent that may affect someone else. But to my extent, to what extent do I have an obligation to protect my own health? Number one, from not engaging in potentially health compromising activities, as well as engaging in preventive medicine. That's what I wanted to kind of focus on, and just set that with, that's just one example. But I want to focus more not on particular behaviors that a person might engage in that would potentially be hazardous, though we'll dovetail on that, but focus more on engaging in activities or medically recommended procedures or particular behaviors that would be preventive. So with that, I want to kind of begin by quoting to you in Shulchan Aruch, at the end of Choshen Mishpat, the end of the whole voluminous work of, which is basically civil and tort and issues related to monetary and fiscal issues. So towards the end, there is a siman, there's a section in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Codes of Jewish Law, that is entitled, in Siman Tov Chof Zayin, Mitzvahs Aseh, Lehasir Kol Mechshol. There is a positive imperative that comes and emanates from the Torah itself, Lehasir Kol Mechshol, to remove any kind of potential hazard, any kind of potential harm, sheyesh bo sakanas nefoshos, that could potentially endanger a person's life. And that's just the title of the section. And it concludes the title, V'asiyas make legago. That's one of the sources. There is a commandment in the Torah that if a person has a rooftop that is able to be used, that there has to be a fence built around it to protect and prevent anyone from falling off. So this concept, this Shulchan Aruch, then goes into detail. Any kind of potential hazard or potential harm, any kind of actual structure or any kind of activity that could potentially cause compromise to one's health and potentially cause loss of life. So there's an imperative that the Torah mandates to remove it and to protect oneself from it. Lihizar b'davar yafa, to be very, very vigilant. Shenemar, and it's based on a number of sources, one that being, Hishamar lecha shmor nafshecha ma'od. That's a pasuk that the Torah describes, Hishamar lecha shmor nafshecha ma'od. You should be very, very careful, very, very protective, and protect your nafshecha ma'od, your soul, your body. The truth of the matter is, in the context of the verse isn't talking about physical. The verse is talking about not forgetting the Torah. But the truth is that is related, because many of the commentators point out that the idea of my obligation, which I want to try to analyze, and I'll formulate my exact question in just a moment, a lot of my obligation to protect my health is based on the fact that by protecting my health, I maximize my opportunity to serve God. And if I don't protect my health, then I will compromise my ability to serve God. So there is an aspect of the body and the soul kind of being interdependent. So I'm going to want to clarify that in a moment. Just wanted to read to you what the Shulchan Aruch says. V'imlo heisir, and if there was some kind of harm that was apparent or evident and a person didn't, then the person violates this halacha. And further on, Shulchan Aruch in that same siman talks about kol ha'over al dvarim elu. Let's say a person wants to drive recklessly, or wants to walk, drive while texting. Want to drive while texting, for example. And says, Hareini misakein ba'atzmi. So first of all, the person is endangering others. So that itself is an issue. But let's say the person is on an empty road. And if they text, they may become distracted, and they may actually collide with something, not, let's say, another person. Imagine a scenario. So the person says, what is it anyone else's business what I do? If it affects someone else, I understand, but just focusing on the person, him or herself. Hareini misakein ba'atzmi, I'm going to endanger myself. Mala cher malai. So what does it matter to other people about me? That's my prerogative as an individual. I have independent rights, I have autonomy, I have liberties, I have the right to engage in activities, the right to pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. So maybe this isn't the life part, but this is the happiness part. Person likes to text while they're driving, whatever it may be. I'm not so careful, I'm not so concerned. So Shulchan Aruch is very critical of that approach, that a person has an obligation. That's what it seems to be, the person has an obligation. So to what extent is that really true? That's the question I want to pose and try to answer. We certainly know that from a Torah perspective, if a person has some kind of medical condition, that not only is it permitted, but it's considered to be mandatory from a Torah perspective to pursue conventional medicine. We do not rely on the notion that God will perform miracles. We don't follow the views of, let's say, Christian scientists or even other approaches that limit medical advances or accessibility. We strongly promote it. Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva, has a response Rav Feinstein does about, is there any compromise in my emunah and my faith in God if I take out life insurance? So Rav Moshe has a tshuva there. He talks about that that's not an issue. The basic idea, I believe, is the fact that life insurance is something that's considered to be routine. It's not considered to be like a special category that only a small group of people use. Life insurance is something that's generally pursued as a routine. Therefore, to pursue something that's considered by society, by people in general, as a routine to protect oneself or one's family is not considered to be a compromise in my faith in God. I'll rely on God. God will take care of the family if, God forbid, something happens. So that's not a violation. On the contrary, that is, in a sense, the way that God operates in this world. God doesn't operate through nis nigla. The commentators point out that God really doesn't like to change nature. He doesn't like the fact that he broke the laws of nature in Egypt was not his design. His design is to work through nature, with nature, in tandem with nature. So that's the natural world, but there's also the natural world of society as a whole, that God functions through nature. So if there is such a thing as life insurance, it's because God felt that that's something appropriate and put it into whoever's mind it was to create it. Whether it was, what's the famous life insurance company? There's a... what? Oh, John Hager, right. So put it into whatever the minds to be able to create it. The fact that there's such a thing as medicines like digoxin, for example. God created the plant, the digitalis plant, that allows for digoxin that helps people with heart conditions. This person doesn't say, I don't need digoxin, my heart will work just fine without it. God says, this is the way, if you believe in me, then you will operate through nature, through the natural world, and through the way society conducts itself appropriately through nature. through natural societal rules. So pursuing life insurance, pursuing medicines, pursuing all these things are the way that God operates in the world. God is the notion that we have in Judaism. There's a difference between a nes nigla and a nes nister. A nes nigla is something that's blatantly and brazenly against and opposing the laws of nature. And God doesn't like to break the laws of nature. He created nature, so to break that is, in a sense, kind of an affront to how he created the world. So sometimes in the course of history, God had to break the laws of nature. In a sense, actually, if you remember from Pirkei Avos, from Ethics of the Father, many of these suspended episodes of nature were already incorporated in God's plan from the beginning, from the 6 days of creation. God operates through what's known as nes nister, namely miracles that are kind of concealed, or that perhaps in some ways better put, that are part of what we take for granted as nature. Every time a person's heart beats, that's a miracle. If you examine the way the heart functions, examine the way the brain functions, these are unbelievable miracles. The way that our bodies operate is miracles. The way the society functions in a positive way is also somewhat miraculous. The fact that society operates at all is sometimes miraculous. But the fact that people can get together and create institutions like insurance or like hospitals is all part of the nes nister that God operates through. Electricity is part of nes nister, that this is the way God operates. So to deny that, in a sense, is not actually conforming with faith in God. On the contrary, it's actually somewhat of an affront to God, because this is the way God operates. So we know that pursuing medical treatments for diseases is not only permissible, but obligatory. We know that because we violate Shabbos to save a person's life. One couldn't violate Shabbos to save a person's life if it wasn't obligatory. So we know that. The question is, and this is the question, to pursue certain behaviors or activities that will help a person protect their health. Is that something that I'm obligated to pursue, or I'm permitted to pursue but not obligated? For example, if there are recommendations of the American Medical Society and the American Gastroenterology Society, whatever their respective names are, whoever puts out the protocols, to have colonoscopies, to have a colonoscopy done starting at the age of 50, and then, depending on the results, every 5 years or so. So what if a person doesn't want to have a colonoscopy? They don't want to be put out. They're afraid of the sedation. They're afraid of the anesthesia. They're afraid of a potential complication of perforation, that maybe the physician will make a hole in their colon accidentally. It's a risk. It's a small risk. In the hands of good gastroenterologists, it's very low. But the point being, the person doesn't want to. The person is squeamish. The person says, I'm not worried about the risks. I'm not worried about that. I just don't want to spend the time. I don't want to have a colonoscopy. Why would a person, why are the recommendations? Because unfortunately, colon cancer is one of the more common forms of cancer. And colon cancer can easily metastasize and spread. And colon cancer can be and does, fortunately, cause significant numbers of deaths in the United States. So the screening for colon cancer through colonoscopy is certainly something that is recommended by the health profession. Question is, from a halachic Jewish perspective, is that something I can take advantage of? I'm permitted to, but I'm not obligated to. If I ask my rabbi, if I ask my Jewish pastor, if I ask my theologian, am I obligated to undergo colonoscopies, or, for example, mammographies, breast imaging, leaving out the recommendations a number of years ago of increasing the age at which women should have their baseline, which I think I would certainly not conform to. The recommendations, the original ones, are, I think, the more appropriate ones, that mammographies, but leaving out the details of when a woman should have a baseline mammography and then how frequently to have follow-ups. Can a woman say that mammographies, women who have had it, no, I obviously can't relate to it, but I know that women describe that it's a very uncomfortable procedure, mammography. And it can be very, very intimidating, it can be very vulnerable, as well as physically very uncomfortable. So a woman says, I don't want to have mammographies. Am I obligated to? And would it make a difference if she has in her family history of breast cancer, or if she has had in their family history of some of the genetics that increase the risk for women, the BRCA genes. So can a woman decide, I certainly can have it if I wish to? Certainly, halacha would never prohibit such a thing. Halacha supports this. And the question is, does Judaism mandate it? And in spite of the discomfort, or in spite of the concerns, or in spite of the risks with colonoscopy, mammography, is a person obligated to pursue these preventive screenings? Or is a person not obligated to, but may do so? That's what I wanted to kind of focus on. I wanted to focus on that. We know that certainly certain activities that endanger one's life, if I eat for breakfast, lunch, and supper, potato chips that are highly salted, which I would actually do if I could, I happen to, whatever. If we know that endangers, if a person has certain diets that are clearly endangering. It's one thing to have, a little nash on Shabbos, because we know that medically that has no effect. So, because it goes to the neshama yisera, and the neshama yisera leaves after Shabbos, comes back later. So the neshama yisera absorbs all that. So the neshama yisera actually gets, that's why it's called neshama yisera. It keeps growing and growing. But we know that certain activities, like to cross the street at a red light. I remember Rav David Lifshitz, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, from Yeshiva University, I think had this quip that you can't cross the street, because the pasuk says in Bamidbar, when the Torah is talking about not passing through certain locations, about Edom. So Edom is a play on words. So Al Tavor bi Edom. Don't pass against the red light. So we know that certain endangering, to drive while texting, no one would say that that's permitted. No one would say that's permitted, because that's an act of endangerment, or certain let's say, aspect of a person's certain lifestyles that may be endangering. The question is, I'm just going to be passive. I'm not going to be screened for colonoscopy or for breast cancer or for cervical cancer or whatever other preventive. I'm not going to even be screened, let's say, for high blood pressure. It's not even an invasive procedure. Person has, either at home, they have their Omron machine, or the doctors, they get screened for high blood pressure. So as a person, there's no risk in having screening for high blood pressure, for hypertension. There's nothing invasive. There's no risk. There's nothing at all. It's a very non-invasive, very basic screening. Yet, and we know that hypertension, high blood pressure, is a major risk factor for heart disease, for stroke, for kidney disease. That's so hypertension is oftentimes referred to as like the silent killer, because oftentimes, more often than not, a person may have high blood pressure and not have any symptoms. A person may have symptoms. They may have headaches or something, but oftentimes hypertension there's no symptoms associated with it, but there are potential complications that accrue over many years of suffering from high blood pressure in terms of damage to the kidneys and the arteries to the brain and to the heart. So if a person says, okay, I can get screened, I can go to the doctor, get my blood pressure taken, I can have my machine at home, but I don't want to. I'm not interested in that. So there's no risk there. There's no discomfort. There's no pain. Yeah, it's slightly uncomfortable while they squeeze on the vein, fine, but it's not like a mammography, and certainly not like those procedures or colonoscopies. So the person have a right to say, I can do it, but I'm not mandated. That's just what I wanted to focus on and try to flesh out. So I'd like to share with you a few ideas from what there's a wonderful work in halacha by Dr. Abraham S. Abraham. Dr. Abraham is now retired from Shaare Zedek Hospital, I think assistant director of internal medicine. So he wrote a work that's really become very, very universally regarded, called Nishmat Avraham. And it's a work on Shulchan Aruch all the way from the beginning of Or Chaim all the way to the very end. And every halacha, every law in the codes that has anything to do with medical issues, he excerpts, and then he quotes all kinds of sources from the Rishon, from medieval period, through the responsa literature, and through contemporary poskim in Eretz Yisrael. And he has discussions. So he has a whole section on refuah monat, of preventive medicine. He has a whole section on that and talks about various issues regarding that. So one issue that's relevant is that what rights do I have, what authority do I have over my own body? We know that no one else has rights over my body. No one else is permitted to harm me or in any way compromise me. To what extent do I have kind of control over my health, over my well-being? To what extent am I? And so they quote let me just find the quote from the Rambam. He quotes from the Rambam, writes, it's based on the Talmud, the Rambam Maimonides, who was a doctor. The Rambam became a doctor. If you're familiar with the history, the Rambam had a brother. I forget his brother's name. The Rambam had a brother who was a businessman. Was Avram ben Rambam was the son, I think, right? Was named after the brother? No, probably the Rambam's brother. His brother was Avram. So the Rambam had a brother who was a businessman, and he supported the Rambam, who was learning, studying, writing, and then his brother perished at sea based on a business voyage. So that's when the Rambam then went into medicine professionally to support himself. That was before Obamacare, of course, because that would not have worked. But anyways, so this is being recorded, isn't it? So the Rambam became a physician at that time. So the Rambam, there's a description, actually, Dr. Abraham has it elsewhere, there's a description of the Rambam's daily schedule, his daily itinerary. He describes that when he lived in Egypt, he used to go to serve the Sultan in Egypt, I think in Cairo or Alexandria, and he would go there to the palace and basically make rounds and take care of the royal family. And then he would return home later in the day, and he described that he was just exhausted. And we tied in, there was a whole line of people waiting for him for medical advice, and not for rabbinic advice, for medical advice. He writes that he didn't have time really to advise his community on spiritual matters except for Shabbos, I think he writes. So people used to line up, and he just used to go to literally in the wee hours of the night and just be exhausted and hungry and all of that. So the Rambam writes in his work, the Rambam writes that that I'm not permitted to injure anyone else, that we understand. I'm not permitted to injure myself. Self-mutilation or self-injury is considered to be prohibited. It's considered to be a biblical violation, that if a person harms oneself, it's considered to be a violation of the Torah. And he says that the Rambam writes in a certain context there, she'ein nafsho shel zeh ner kinyan goel hadam el kinyan hakadosh baruch hu. And they quote from on the commentary on the side of the Rambam in Hilchos Sanhedrin, the Ridvaz, who writes a similar notion, which I'll explain in just a moment more deliberately. nafsho shel adam kinyano el kinyan hakadosh baruch hu. That this notion that the Rambam has, that's reinforced, is that my life is not my proprietary rights, that I don't own my life, that my life belongs to God, and an extension of this idea, say that I'm like a custodian to my life. God imbued me with life, and I am the custodian of that neshama, that soul, that life, for the period of time that I'm on earth, and therefore, what? The body, right? The body, the soul, everything, correct, both the physical and the spiritual. I'm a custodian, and therefore, as a custodian, God entrusts me as a custodian, and therefore I have to be very, very careful in how I take care of this body and this soul that God has given me the responsibility to take care of. So that notion speaks, if one translate into a little bit more of a technical legal perspective, that one could argue, based on this, that a person has no rights over their own. They have to do everything that is in concert with the optimal care of one's body and soul, focusing now that's on the body, and that I don't have the right in any way to compromise that, in accordance with what's considered to be societally acceptable, and otherwise what's considered to be routine and what's considered to be appropriate. So that notion is that I don't have any personal rights. I have responsibilities. That's one approach that one can take. We generally assume that these phrases are not to be taken categorically, that I don't have any rights, I don't have any decision-making for myself. We believe that a person has decision-making. That part of the approach is that, unlike perhaps the opposite extreme, where I have total rights over my body and and I can do anything I wish with my body as long as it doesn't harm someone else, and that I have no obligation to myself because I am only answerable to myself. So this is saying I'm not only answerable to myself, I'm answerable to God as well. And so the Chavetz Chaim also has an idea that on a certain level, the notion of protecting myself so that I can serve God is part of this idea, that I'm answerable to God. But it doesn't mean, therefore, that because I'm answerable to God, does that mean, therefore, that I cannot in any way make any independent decisions? That would mean that everybody has to make the same basic decisions consistently, that we all have to pursue whatever activities and refrain from whatever activities because we have no personal freedom. It's all based on kind of like religious responsibility to God. So we generally assume that that's not so, that there are areas in which we have the right to make decisions. So it's interesting that he quotes the following. He quotes, Dr. Abraham quotes, which I will find in just a moment. Bear with me for just a moment. He discusses this whole notion. Okay, so that each person may have certain limitations that may differentiate one person from another. That is true. That is true. For example, he talks here about, based also on the Rambam, about exercise. The Rambam talks very, very strongly about being active and being various kinds of exercises that are very helpful. Some people, have limitations in terms of the exercise, but obviously the notion that a person should keep oneself in good health. But he says, "V'neshuv l'sheila shesha'alti." Question is, ha'im yesh chiyuv le'adam bari, a healthy person, or presumably healthy person, lishmoa lahamlatzot ho'ela, to listen to these recommendations of screening that we mentioned. O ha'im heim begeder hamlatzot bilvad, their recommendations. V'halacha somechas al hadiyah mekubelas b'rufuah, shmati me'ikon v'shlomo zalman Orbach, that she'ein kol chiyuv she'adam yatseis l'hamlatzot le'vada yim hu mefached mehabedikot. That if a person is, let's say, concerned about certain investigations, certain procedures, certain tests, has a certain fear, that the person has the concern that a person, even though it's appropriate and recommended that a person listen to medical advice, like high blood pressure and the like. Nonetheless, one can't necessarily obligate the person absolutely if they have such a trepidation. So one has to kind of analyze that a little bit. Why would I not have an obligation to be concerned about high blood pressure? So if I've been diagnosed with high blood pressure, so then I already have a condition. So then no one would say that I'm permitted to ignore that. Why would that be different than the obligation to pursue antibiotics if a person has an infection that could be serious? So you understand, but do I have an obligation to find out if I have high blood pressure? So if I get the impression that these kinds of screenings that a person may be afraid of or concerned about, even something as innocuous as blood pressure screening, and certainly something like mammographies or colonoscopies, that apparently a person has some liberty to say that I'm concerned or afraid of a particular procedure. I'm not sure what their fear is regarding blood pressure screening, but he mentions lachat stam, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, things like that, that a person has the prerogative to pursue or not pursue. Why that is a good question. I don't fully understand why that would be. That a person is obligated to pursue healthy approaches to life, but that doesn't mean, therefore, a person has to engage in every recommended screening. Why would that be? If a person already was diagnosed with high cholesterol, or diagnosed with high blood pressure, or diagnosed with a polyp or colon cancer, or some kind of precancerous mass in whatever part of the body, whether it's colon or breast, there we would say a person is not only permitted, obligated to pursue treatment from a Jewish perspective. We would not subscribe to the notion of just kind of letting God take care of it. This is the way God does take care of it, through medicines, through procedures, through the proxies of physicians who are the shlichim, who are the representatives and ambassadors of God. So why would we say that to not find out about something, to kind of avoid knowledge, that I am not obligated to become aware of that? That's a little bit unclear to me. The Rav Neuwirth, in his classic work, Shmirat Shabbos Kilchasa, and Hilchos Shabbos, Rav Neuwirth, who was very, very close to Dr. Abraham, passed away a number of years ago. So Rav Neuwirth describes in Hilchos Shabbos the following: Adam Bari, a healthy person, Asher Yesh Chashash, there's a concern, Sheyechle b'machla midbeket, it might contract a contagious disease, an infectious disease that could become serious. So it's permissible to violate Shabbos to prevent that from happening. Person is now healthy, but there's a concern that they might be exposed to some contagion and therefore could become medically inoculated with that. So one can violate Shabbos not only to treat active disease, but to prevent the possibility of contracting a disease that could become life-threatening. Therefore, an example of that would mean, let's say you have somebody at home who has some kind of infectious disease or contagious infectious disease, and that person himself or herself does not require hospitalization. However, there are other people at home who are being exposed to that person and have, let's say, nowhere else to go to kind of stay, that would be permissible to transport the patient who doesn't in and of him or herself need any further treatment right now, but permitted to transport that person by vehicle, by car, driven by a Jew on Shabbos to, let's say, a hospital for quarantine, whatever, in order that the other members of the family would be protected. It also is not clear, they've already been exposed. So how do we know that they haven't already contracted or have the contagion already kind of percolating and incubating in them? We don't know that. But the possibility of preventing that kind of disease that could be life-threatening even permits us to suspend Shabbos. So if Shabbos can be suspended to prevent a disease, it would seem to me that I should be obligated to engage in preventive screening to prevent disease. You could argue, well, there we know that there is already a present risk. There is somebody with this disease, and I am exposed to that person, so there is actually a disease that presents itself. As opposed to colon cancer, which there's no basis to assume the person has. High blood pressure, there's no basis to assume it has. So therefore, maybe I'm not obligated to pursue those. I'm not sure why there would be a distinction between those. Oh, okay, fine, very good. I'm not sure why there would be a difference between those scenarios. Just because I don't know something, why does that somehow relinquish my responsibilities? If I know that somebody here has a contagious disease, then I can violate Shabbos to protect myself. But if I don't know that I have high blood pressure, so somehow that ignorance allows me to kind of say I'm not obligated to pursue it. I'm not sure why ignorance should allow me. A person doesn't have any symptoms that would indicate colon cancer or anything, so I have no awareness. A person may have had high blood pressure for the last 5 years and be totally unaware of it. Why is the ignorance of something allows me to say that I have the right to determine what happens with my body and not a kind of moral halachic obligation to pursue a treatment that could prevent a serious disease? If I can violate Shabbos to prevent spread of disease, why am I not just absolutely obligated always to do so? The pasuk says, just to wind down, the pasuk says in Beshalach that when God brings out the Jews from Egypt, so he says, Kol hamachla shesamti v'mitzrayim, any kind of illness that I kind of imposed upon the Egyptians, Lo asim alecha, I will not place upon you, kinei Hashem rofecha, because I'm your physician, I'm your healer. Meaning to prevent something is the ultimate of refuah. It's the ultimate of preventive medicine, is the ultimate to prevent something from occurring. That's why it says in Shulchan Aruch doesn't distinguish between situations where a person has something that is readily apparent as a hazard, as a threat, versus engaging in, let's say, inactive screening. Not sure why there should be a difference it seems that there is such a possibility that a person would not be obligated. I don't fully understand it. I would assume that the obligation to protect myself, number one, because I have a responsibility to God to protect myself, as well as my own kind of intrapersonal obligations to myself, to take care of myself. The Gemara has, just to conclude, the Talmud has a principle that that when it comes, let's say, to two people, both of whom need help to be saved, so I'm not obligated to sacrifice my life to help save someone else. Maybe I can put myself at risk to save someone's life, that's fine, but I'm not obligated to sacrifice. My life, to me, is the ultimate priority over anyone else's life. That doesn't mean I can in any way compromise another person's life, but in terms of consideration for myself, my life comes first, not only because it belongs to God, because why then is that person's life also belongs to God? That's because as a human being, God wants us to view ourselves as of infinite value, as a olam mole. Adam was created alone to indicate that every human being is of infinite world value. Therefore, I have an obligation to myself out of self-respect and dignity to kavod habrios. The concept of respect of human beings and dignity first comes with respect to how I treat myself. And therefore, I should have an obligation to say that I'm not obligated to have blood pressure screening or mammographies or colonoscopies because of my concerns or my discomfort or my inconvenience, whatever the legitimate basis would be, that I have a right to do so when I can violate Shabbos to save people's life, to prevent things, is a little bit difficult for me. And apparently, there is such a possibility. You have to kind of analyze this passage in this section, and Dr. Abraham's a little bit more so, but just to kind of throw that out as an idea of preventive medicine as something that is certainly strongly supported by Judaism, arguably mandated, maybe not always, but certainly something that would be considered to be something of pursuit to protect ourselves and to kind of mimic God, who is the ultimate healer by preventive, to kind of mimic him in that regard, and to understand that our lives have value, infinite value, value religiously, spiritually, as well as physically. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions? We have a couple more minutes before we're going to start to Hillel. Any questions for Rabbi Weiss? Thank you so much.
Okay. One thing. Right. So that's a good question. How that pasuk is quoted as if nafshechem refers to the physical, because sometimes we say the pasuk ki adam hu hanefesh. Sometimes nefesh refers to the spirit, sometimes refers to the physical. So it can be either one. But you're right, the Mevorshim do talk about the fact that it refers more in the context to the spiritual. So they have discussions about that. I don't know the specific answer. I was just mentioning, based on something else that the Chavetz Chaim says, that part of the reason why I have to protect my body is because I have to protect my nefesh, my neshama. Because if I don't protect my body, the neshama will have nowhere to occupy, and therefore I'm not subscribing to that aspect. Thank you. Okay.
Full lecture series. We're very grateful at STAJE for all that she's done. And of course, we're thankful to each and every one of you for coming. I'm sure other people have other things that they could have been doing. It's not easy to get here to all the different locations, and we're very grateful for everyone to coming. I've spoken to many of you over the last couple of weeks, some in person, some by phone, about who we are and what we're trying to do. Our goal is, again, to try to offer opportunities for really what we've been discussing over the last 4 weeks, particularly to pick up on Dr. Dorn's theme. The opportunities for engagement, for activity, for attentiveness was her word. Whether that's through learning or through volunteer opportunities, we're looking to try to find ways to work with you to find things that you're interested in and that we can arrange, we can orchestrate, we can facilitate, we can launch, and ways to really help the entire community, both locally and throughout the area. So if people have ideas, we have some survey forms in the back on the market teats table, and my cards are out. I'd love to hear people's feedback and thoughts. And I don't want to take up any more of anybody's time, so I'm just going to call up Rabbi Dr. Weiss, who is really very uniquely qualified to speak. The theme is, I believe, Torah perspectives on medical issues, and as a rabbi practicing in a quite large local kehillah, I've been davening there quite recently, and it's really a very special place. The camaraderie, both to me as somewhat of an outsider and watching between the congregants after davening, before davening, is really very special. So as a Rav of a local shul, as a doctor, someone who has a great perspective on medical issues, on Torah issues, and I'd like to call up Rabbi Dr. Weiss.
Moshe also has a tshuva. Think about like football players, like in terms of the risks that they take. So it talks about this issue. So just interesting historically that he already discussed this issue back in the early part of the 20th century, even before it was more brought up to date in terms of smoking and various issues associated with it. So the question that, just to use that as a starting point, to what extent do I have an obligation to myself? Let's just focus on myself as an individual. Let's say I'm not talking about to what extent I may affect someone else. Maybe we'll come to that in terms of a person who has a contagious disease, to what extent that may affect someone else. But to my extent, to what extent do I have an obligation to protect my own health? Number one, from not engaging in potentially health compromising activities, as well as engaging in preventive medicine. That's what I wanted to kind of focus on, and just set that with, that's just one example. But I want to focus more not on particular behaviors that a person might engage in that would potentially be hazardous, though we'll dovetail on that, but focus more on engaging in activities or medically recommended procedures or particular behaviors that would be preventive. So with that, I want to kind of begin by quoting to you in Shulchan Aruch, and at the end of Choshen Mishpat, the end of the whole voluminous work of, which is basically civil and tort and issues related to monetary and fiscal issues. So towards the end there is...
Continue the program. Okay. Evaluations, as I said, are being handed out now. So, and again, please return them, for both sessions at the end of the time. I'm sure everybody unfortunately woke up this morning to hear the terrible news that we heard. And I've been asked to announce, someone just got it on an iPhone, that there's a worldwide Tehillim taking place at 3 p.m. So that'll be right as this program is finishing. And we're asked to say the parakim of 120, 121, and 130. So if everybody could take that, if they want to stay a few extra minutes, I'm sure there's Tehillim in the back, but we can't discount ever the importance of davening, and certainly davening as a united front. And that's certainly something that our peace partners don't understand. So again, it's parakim 120, 121, and 130. We certainly can. Absolutely. I think that would be very, I assume there's probably Tehillim. I'm going to look and see, well, if I can find, how many Tehillims I can find. It is my pleasure to call upon Rabbi Aryeh Bursik from STAJE, who will tell us a little bit about STAJE, and will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Rabbi Steinig. Thank you again for all of the work that you put in for all 4 weeks of this wonderful
work on Shmiras Halashon, on the protection and dignity of speech. Every year, the Chofetz Chaim Heritage Foundation sponsors videos on Tisha B'Av regarding this particular issue. So the Chofetz Chaim wrote voluminously his classic work on Halacha, Mishnah Berurah, but he has in his Sfarim Likutei Amorim the following kind of digression from his main theme that he was discussing there. But it's very interesting to look at it from a historical perspective, because we're all familiar with the Surgeon General's warnings that came out in the 1960s regarding cigarette smoking. So the Chofetz Chaim, speaking in, I don't know when he wrote this, presumably around 1920s or so, wrote the following: Agav, Dasi Lidan, I want to kind of digress and talk about Odos Ishun HaSigarin, the smoking of cigarettes. Nedaber Ktsat Odot Zeh, Hine Kama Rofim, even at that time, 1920s. So Kama Rofim Gozru, that somebody who perhaps has a predisposition to illnesses, perhaps their constitution is not so healthy, so that cigarette smoking is a potential issue. So he talks about this particular issue of cigarette smoking early on. Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva, talks about cigarette smoking and the approach to that, and whether the issue of the fact that a person has the right to engage in certain recreational activities. To what extent does a person have a right to engage in recreational activities? To what right does a person have a right to engage in parnasa, in kind of their own professional that can potentially be hazardous? Thank you very much, Rabbi Borsig. I want to thank Rabbi Steinig for spearheading and including our shul, which hosted, I think, last week's session, and 2 weeks ago. Okay, I'm a little out of time. It could be. I'll have to bear that in mind. And all the participating sponsors, Margaret Tietz, of course, and the various organizations, the OU. I want to make sure I don't miss anyone. I'm sure they've been mentioned, but the OU, OHEL, and STAJE. Well, that was just mentioned as well. This also is part of the, I think, so I wanted to take the opportunity this afternoon to speak for a little bit about health issues from a Torah perspective, specifically focusing on preventive medicine, health maintenance, and talk about that from the perspective of Judaism, of Jewish halacha. Acknowledge many of the members from Hillcrest, Young Israel Hillcrest, and welcome to all of you, and hope that this day was meaningful, and hope that you have a healthy winter. In terms of print, don't forget the flu vaccine as well. But that is related to this issue, but I'm not going to talk about vaccines specifically at the moment. But I wanted to begin with the following description as recorded by the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim from Radin, who died in like 1933, is well known for his work